In this recording, I will spend a little bit of time talking about stereotyping and implicit bias. So, stereotyping really is nothing more than associations or generalizations we might have about groups of people. So we may, for example, believe that athletes aren't great students, right? So we might have that idea that athletes are more likely to expend their energy training and therefore are not as much interested in working hard on their academics, the kind of maybe a stereotypical jock idea. So that's just one idea, is there's a group. In this case, athletes is a very umbrella group term, and we draw some kind of conclusion about the group. And then the kind of further application of the idea of stereotyping, or where that might link up to social perception bias, is when we identify a person as part of that category. So if you meet a person who you find is an athlete, then you actually apply your belief about the group of athletes to that person. So that's judging a person, an individual, based on some kind of global properties of a group that you categorize them into. And ultimately, stereotypes in general are not good or bad. We have kind of a natural human process again. We're confronted with, millions, if not billions, of bits of information, and our minds are constantly processing this information. And we have developed this capability to kind of quickly decide if something is a threat or it's benign. And over human history, kind of categorizing things into groups, whether that's humans into different groups as friend or foe, or other kinds of threats like, is this an animal that's a friend, or is this an animal that's a threat, for example. So these are natural and functional tendencies that we have. The challenge is that when we kind of automatically allow ourselves to judge a person based on a group, we oftentimes are going to make mistakes. So, you can think over a little bit, like, what are some commonly held stereotypes? I gave you the example of like the dumb jock. You can think through different kinds of social groups, different cultural groups, and come up with some generalized stereotypes you might hold or you've heard about those groups. We can talk a little bit more in class about the origins of those stereotypes and what some of those are that we might hold. So one source of trouble with stereotypes, even though they are functional for kind of our cognitive processing, I just mentioned, is that, we may incorrectly apply our beliefs about a group to an individual without kind of understanding that person as an individual who's distinct from the group to which they belong. Another generalized problem with stereotyping is this kind of trade-off between so-called in-group bias and out-group discrimination. And the moment we categorize ourselves as part of a group and others as part of the other group, we set up an in-group, out-group distinction. And, volumes and volumes of social psychological research show us that we favor the in-group. So whatever we kind of put ourselves as part of, if I decide that I'm an academic and that's the group that I call myself, or a university employee, the second I think of myself in that group, I favor that group. Even if I consciously know there are issues or problems with academics or with university employees, I'm still going to generally favor that group as opposed to some other group of employees that I might be thinking about. So we tend to have this in-group favoritism and then out-group discrimination. So we tend to, look with at least some suspicion on people who are part of the other and not part of our group. So again, that's kind of a natural process, but it's a dangerous process because we oftentimes are much more forgiving to flaws we see within our group and much more interested in pointing out the problems of the other group. I think we can think of plenty of examples in society about this, not the least of which is the extremely negative partisanship in our country these days politically. So that's clearly an intergroup problem, intergroup conflict, and raging examples of in-group favoritism and out-group bias happening and out-group discrimination. So closely associated with stereotyping is implicit bias. And kind of the implicit bias connection is that the stereotype information that we have developed over time, these associations that we make and assumptions we make about groups of people, they become more automatic. And that's the challenge, is that these stereotypes exist and they have formed in our minds from our experience and information we've been kind of fed our entire lives. And eventually they just become automatic, and we don't even consciously stop to think about, are we feeling a little bit uncertain if we encounter somebody from a different group? Are we automatically kind of raising up our hackles if we realize that someone's from that other party? So it's this automatic processing is the implicit bias part, or kind of why this can lead to implicit bias. It's important to recognize that implicit bias is not the same thing as discrimination. So I think, one challenge that we have whenever we bring up this terminology, and sometimes, remember your maps, if you start to hear this and it makes you feel a little bit defensive or disbelieving about these ideas, remember that it's worth slowing down a little bit to think about, why might you resist the idea that there's implicit bias? And I think one way to help with this, again, is it's not the same thing as discrimination. And it's not trying to tell people that they are overtly prejudiced and, attempting to harm people from different groups than they're from. So that's a really important thing to set up, that implicit bias is not the same thing as discrimination. However, it can lead to discrimination even when people are, think they're being fair. And we'll talk about this when we come back to class. It's why I assigned that article about the myth of the meritocracy, and how kind of counterintuitively the organizations that adopt a meritocracy and people who believe that their workplace promotes and rewards people based on meritocracy are almost more harmed by implicit bias, because they feel like, hey, we've put this system in place, so now we're good and I don't need to worry about these kinds of things. When in reality, there's still many, many places where these implicit biases just cause us to make some small differentiators in terms of our reviews and our processing of information. Again, not intentionally. Obviously, there are people who are prejudiced. There are people who are intentionally biased. There are people who are intentionally discriminatory. But I strongly believe most people are not, and they are trying to do the right thing. But the reality is these implicit biases are real, and they do alter how we process information, and they may lead us to make judgments and decisions that we believe are being rational, but in fact are being altered by some of these biases. So, I think a couple other things, and maybe reasons why sometimes people bristle or resist this idea of implicit bias, is that there is not strong research saying if I take a test and I am shown to have implicit bias, that does not produce a strong prediction of my individual behavior. So the connection between an individual's level of implicit bias and their individual decisions and actions, is only loosely correlated. Where we do see things is that if you look at aggregate data, if you look at entire groups of people, and if they sort of are higher on some types of implicit bias than others, we can see these outcomes. So for example, there's research that shows, using some of the data collected from the implicit association tests, that communities where there's higher levels of racial implicit bias have more police shootings, kind of racially based police shootings, or disparities across race and shootings. So we can see that subtle differences in kind of average levels will predict some variation in unfortunately, in this case, extremely negative outcomes. And so we do need to care about this because real world discrimination occurs and continues. So a couple examples of these kind of experimental studies that have done this. For example, there's been research, many different kinds of research, where academics have put together resumes, and they made an identical resume, and all they change is the name and whether the name seems to be more Caucasian or Black. They've also done this with other kind of ethnic sounding names. And in study after study, what they show is that the ethnic or Black named resumes, even though they're identical in every other way, get fewer callbacks and fewer responses on the part of employers. There's also kind of really sad and difficult research that shows that physicians actually treat people of color differently than white people in terms of the amount of pain medications they prescribe with the same kinds of severity of injuries. And I think, again, the important thing to take away is that, I think in all these cases, those HR professionals screening or hiring managers screening those resumes are not intentionally saying, I'm going to take all the white people and put them in the top of the pile. Physicians aren't saying, I don't think Black people feel pain the same way white people do, so I'm not going to give them as much medication. Rather, it's just these kind of subtle imprintings on our part of these stereotypes and associations between people from different groups or different categories, and particular kinds of attributes or attitudes that line up that can alter our ultimate decisions. And we'll look at a little bit more of this research and some interesting simulation data that shows how even a very small amount of bias, if you sort of run it out over the course of what would be equivalent to many years in an organization, will produce fairly broad problems in terms of pay discrimination, in terms of promotion and advancement for women versus men, and these other kinds of things. So the takeaway again here is that none of this research is trying to suggest anyone's bad or anyone's trying intentionally to harm others, but to really recognize that we are subjected to these kinds of biases. We develop them just without thought over our lives. And I think relative to what we talked about in the Heidi Roizen case, for example, those reactions to Heidi versus Howard were equal from women and men. So again, it's also not trying to suggest that men are discriminatory and women aren't. On these same kinds of tests, women and men will sort of display a stronger preference for male leaders because it's just what we've been exposed to over our lifetime. So it's really essential to recognize that these sorts of biases exist and that they can affect us in subtle ways that when we are working in our conscious mode, don't really understand that we might be making subtle, differentials in our decisions as a result of these biases. So just for a few concluding comments, implicit bias is it's a complex concept and could form the basis of an entire psych class. But for our purposes here, I just want to make it clear kind of what this is versus explicit bias and what this is versus kind of explicit stereotyping. So in a nutshell, we all have attitudes. So there are concepts. There are the concept of women and men. There are concepts of subjects or fields of study. And so we have attitudes toward those. And some of us have explicit attitudes, right? We might say, I love math, or I love finance, or I love financial accounting. And we may state that and be aware that we have that attitude toward that subject matter. But the reality is that even when we profess a certain explicit attitude, we may have some implicit underlying attitude. So it may be that, that you hear enough groaning stories about accounting that even if you have a positive attitude toward accounting, you might still have heard enough people say negative things about accounting in your life that you have some implicit attitude that you're not as consciously aware of, that there's a negative association between, accounting and attitudes. So we all have these sorts of, on the surface, explicit attitudes, and these implicit attitudes we've kind of accumulated over time. Likewise, as I've already mentioned, we have the same kinds of things with stereotypes. Some are explicit. We might believe that men and women are equally capable of doing science, and we may profess that and say there's no difference. There should be no expectation that we don't have at least 50-50 enrollment in science programs at the university. But again, we may, even when we hold that explicit stereotype that men and women are equal, we may have some implicit stereotype that women aren't as good at science or math, for example. And again, this could have just developed over time because we see far fewer women in STEM and science fields. We don't see them portrayed. We don't see their names displayed in terms of prizes won and other things. And so if that's our entire life experience, is when we see some prominent scientist, more often than not that's going to be a man, then our minds start to associate science with men. And we tend to think of men as a group as more capable of conducting science. So again, these implicit stereotypes also develop in our minds. And ultimately, we may think this, right, but we automatically associate it because we don't have the kind of representation of these images in our minds. But again, I think the final takeaway here is that we can, I hope, understand that these implicit attitudes, implicit stereotypes, implicit bias exist, and understand that they just develop in kind of a natural pattern of exposure over our lives. Having implicit bias doesn't make you a bad or good person. It just is something that happens about the way we process information. So we may not actually be able to eliminate implicit bias, but what we can do is understand it is operating with most of us, and that at least on average, it can be part of why we see some not equitable outcomes occurring in organizations. So as a final point I want to make, the implicit association test. Before our last class, I sent an email with a link to Harvard's website where they provide a lot of explanation and background on this test. They provide some information on implicit bias in general. But I want to point out, and I want to encourage you, if you didn't have a chance to do that before our last meeting, I'll send another email, and it would be good if you gave it a shot and took one or two of these tests. What's important to know is this is a measure. This is not the same thing as implicit bias. It's one way scientists have kind of come up with a way to try to capture a measurement of implicit bias. And ultimately what they're getting at is they're getting at the association and how fast we can cognitively process information that is sort of counter what's naturally associated in our mind. So that's kind of in a nutshell what they're doing. And again, if you're interested, you can read more of the materials on their site that explain the development and kind of underlying rationale for kind of these responses that you're being prompted to do with associations between descriptive language and categories of people in this case. So there are some limitations to this measurement. It has some problems with retest reliability. So, if you take the test on implicit bias toward LGBTQ people 1 week, and then you take it again a month later, you might get different results. So there is some movement in terms of kind of how you perform on the test. And then, as I've already mentioned, it's not designed to be or expected to be a predictor of individual behavior. So if you find that you have implicit bias toward people of a certain ethnic background, that's not going to be a strong predictor that you will actually discriminate against people from that background. But once again, on a whole, if we have organizations where there's higher or lower average levels of implicit bias, we may just have outcomes happening where subtle differences in Pygmalion, right? Expectations of one group or another may surface in kind of long-term outcomes of promotions, retention, and those kinds of things. So the strengths are that taking these tests can provide you some self-knowledge and some, I guess, recognition, hopefully, of the fact that you do, in fact, have implicit bias, and you can take a variety of them and kind of see where you have higher amounts of this sorts of implicit bias. And then ultimately we can use this as a tool for certain aggregate research to predict outcomes in groups and organizations and communities. But with that, I'll end, and I'll just, I'll encourage you to maybe take a couple of these tests before we come back to class next week. And I will kick this off showing a few results. We'll have a little discussion of your experience in taking the test, and then we'll look a little bit at some more research about the implications of even small amounts of bias, and then talk a little bit about what kinds of interventions can happen. Again, these are not interventions suggesting that individuals are problems, that individuals are intentionally trying to create poor outcomes for groups and organizations. They're more about the fact that we need to actually design our systems and processes with an understanding that implicit bias happens and is real, and therefore we can create fairer workplaces that actually capture performance and reward people based on that performance more equitably, and with some elimination of the impact of these sorts of biases and stereotypes.